Mark Twain once said that there is no such thing as an original idea, and nowhere can this be more evident than in today's triple trillion dollar industry of video games. Played one first-person shooter, you've played them all. I mean, the DNA for shooting in Fallout isn't that far removed from GoldenEye. But if you dig a bit deeper, I think there's two sides to this coin. In another saying that's been thrown around, rip off one thing and it's called plagiarism, but rip off 100 things and that's originality. Now, I've always had a huge and sometimes morbid fascination with franchises and media that try to juggle massively different ideas and aesthetics from wildly different places, because often they collapse under the sheer weight of everything. But sometimes it manages to come together in this sublimely beautiful experience that just somehow coalesces into this beautiful new primordial goo that becomes more than the sum of its parts, and occasionally its very own genre. So how does this all relate to Tales of Iron? Well, this deceptively little game exemplifies this in both good and bad ways, and perhaps even more importantly, it finally shines a light on rats who never get enough love in media, which is a shame because they are surprisingly intelligent and cute. Even better than that though, it exemplifies a very underappreciated genre of games which can best be described as Redwall-esque. Basically, human-like animals in fantasy settings, and even better than all that, it wraps this in very mature and subversive themes. So the question is, does this game manage to mix its huge range of influences into a cohesive experience, or is it a disgusting, repulsive Frankenstein monster that should be burned at the stake? Well, today I'm going to be doing a deep dive into the game's development, story, and mechanics to try to answer this question. Now, if you're new here, welcome. My name is Otto, and in this channel, I'll be delving into games with my jaded, cynical, and very, very tired eyes. If for some morbid reason that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below. So let's start at the very top. Tales of Iron is a side-scrolling RPG and a rat simulator from developer Odd Bug Studio, released in 2021 with overall positive reviews. Nowadays, where Souls-like and side-scrollers are a dime a dozen, it can be hard to stand out. But the heart and soul of this game, and the real meat and potatoes, if you will, is the combat, which has some Souls-like influences, and this also comes out in the overall feel or kind of the zeitgeist of the game. Quote, "We always planned for Tales of Iron to have a much darker tone. We knew we wanted the combat to feel brutal and weighted, which naturally led us to a more gory depiction of combat. At the end of the day, it's rats fighting frogs with medieval weapons. We're depicting a particularly brutal period of combat technology. Now, this is all tied to the overall art style quite nicely, with it matching and complementing the mature world, and it's this really bizarre mix of storybook exterior with a really dark, murderous, grim fairy tale inside. Apparently, as far as inspiration, what came first was actually a love for rats, with the starting point being a desire to create a rat-based game with a dash of The Witcher thrown in for good measure. Now, obviously, this is kind of a fine line to balance, but I think a huge part of why this game has such a unique direction and aesthetic has got to be due to the clear and distinct vision of the team, which has to be tough to do, but probably helped along with the small size of the dev team, which was about 6 people. Now, I feel like large teams can quickly lose their identity under the sheer weight of compromises and the need to make inoffensive mass market appeal, and this can be a shame in a lot of ways. I think the creator of Stardew Valley once said, "At the end of the day, people are just looking for real human soul and experiences, and the more people get involved in a project, the easier it can be to have that diluted." Or in another way of saying, too many cooks in the kitchen. But anyway, what the dev team in Tales of Iron lacked in human power, they more than made up for that with rat power. Many of the rats in the game are based on the director's own pets, and if you look at the extra tab, there's this really cute hand-drawn sketched artwork of all the director's rats, which is a little heartbreaking because sadly rats have a pretty small lifespan and they didn't make it past development. Before we all start crying, let's move on. The developers cited several inspirations for the game. One, which is a personal favorite and I covered extensively on this channel, is Salt and Sanctuary. They also mentioned the incredible Redwall series and Grimm's fairy tale for overall vibe, as well as The Witcher for its narrative-driven journey, along with other works like Mouseguard, Wind in the Willows, and Watership Down, with a dose of Dark Souls combat thrown in for good measure. Now, that's a tall order for any developer, let alone an indie studio, so let's dive in and see how this all works out. So what is the story here? Well, it's pretty simple, really. Geralt tells you a bedtime story about rats. Well, maybe anyway, that is one deep lore fan theory. On the surface anyway, we play as Reggie, the youngest and smallest son of the king on a very special day, because this is the day that will decide who will succeed his father to rule the kingdom. Now, we're fighting our older and much larger brother Dennis for the crown. And this is all much more important because of the ever-looming threats of the vicious neighboring Frog clan, who the rats have been at war with for generations. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is the narration, which is of course Doug Cockle, who voices Geralt, but he knocks it out of the park here. I thought I would only be able to hear Geralt, but the voice really does fit in this story, even though there are plenty of Witcher references in the game. Now, he is quite literally the only voice here, and as such, he does need to do a lot of the heavy lifting for the story, and luckily he pulls this off, and this is made all the better by some pretty top-notch dialogue. Anyway, even at the very start, the game seemingly takes sadistic pleasure in lulling you into a false sense of security. You wake up in these comfy, cute little pajamas, and the game guides you through the tutorial in a beautiful castle filled with gorgeous music and lively little background rats and tapestries as you learn how to craft items, upgrade health, and the basics of combat. This all changes during the first real fight, which has a ton of narrative weight behind it because you're basically fighting for the throne, and you get the impression that no one expects Reggie to win because he's the runt of the litter, but he does. And at the very height of your victory, just as Reggie's about to accept the crown, the frogs attack, led by a bloodthirsty war chief, and it's like Quentin Tarantino, over the top brutal. Your dad is skewered all within a few seconds. Now, I love how quickly, brutally, and just over the top the scene shifts from the high of Reggie winning to his father literally getting impaled, and this is all elevated by really great lighting and music shifts. So in the next scene, we're in the ruins of all this carnage, and this is reinforced when Reggie gets covered in blood during his first real fight to the death. And this is the moment that the game really shows you what's beneath the hood, with bodies of rats hanging from ceilings. And this is even reinforced with the gameplay, with the battles being really unforgiving and just quickly teaching you how to multitask and look for threats coming from all different directions. The frogs are not going to fight fair, so neither will we. It's a simple, effective, and engaging start. We know what the stakes are, and we're giving a clear goal and call to action. We gotta get rid of these gosh darn frogs, and the only way to do that is some good old-fashioned stabbing. What also immediately stuck out to me was the attention to detail. There's all these lovely little background details like rats fighting frogs in the tapestries and these incredible rat statues straight out of Lord of the Rings. It doesn't feel like a 2D game. It feels like a living, breathing world from the start, with all these little details working really well in a narrative sense as well. I mean, at one point the game mentions that Reggie's brother is going to be leading the procession to the tournament grounds, and you can actually see him leading if you go to the front of the procession. Anyway, the first order of business is we gotta find all of our rat bros and clean house. Luckily, our guy Dennis survived a night out drinking on the town during the invasion and was able to let us know that one of our brothers is there, so away we go. The village itself is gorgeous and continues to show the devastation of the frog invasion. It's a veritable rat war zone, houses are burning, bodies are everywhere, it's a rat tragedy. And on the gameplay side, the difficulty is ramped up, so it'll throw a new enemy at you, and then the next encounter, you'll go straight into fighting 2 or 3 of them at once, plus an archer backing them up for good measure. We meet our soon-to-be bro Robin the Ranger and the village elder, who seems pretty checked out, but I guess it's okay because he has this pretty sweet looking clock thing in his room, which really reminded me of Majora's Mask. Maybe it's a nod to it. Anyway, we'll fight our first real boss here, and oh my god, they do not hold back. He is unrelenting, huge, and the attacks have pretty huge AoEs, but the finishing animation makes it all worth it. On the not so positive side of things, the village is where you're going to pick up your first new gear, and it's not really intuitive or explained very well on how to actually change into that gear. You have to change or equip items at these little crates, traits, and I do wonder what the reasoning was for this, because I'm not sure why they'd want to stop players from changing their gear on the go. Anyway, after the village, we go to the farmlands, and the battles still do not let up. We're fighting hordes of frogs at this point, and it just really amps up the scale. Background details, as always, are top notch, and you can even see the future boss in the background of the scenes, which is some really cool foreshadowing. Speaking of mobs, the next boss fight is Lancelot, and it's really drilling into you how to be okay fighting large groups of enemies and multitasking. In his final form, he takes this frog drug, which I didn't notice in my first playthrough, but actually makes a lot of sense on repeats, which we'll come back to later. Anyway, we rescue our brother, and then we have to backtrack. Now, usually backtracking in video games is kind of a pain, but Tales handles this extraordinarily well. On our way back, we go through the farms and the village that we were just in, and we can see that it's all being repaired and cleaned out. And the same with the Crimson Keep, and it's just so cool to see how your actions are actually affecting the world. Back at the throne room, we're seeing our squad come together, even if our guy Dennis is drinking ominously in the back. Now, traveling itself is a little strange. So, for example, we have to fast travel between the village and the Crimson Keep, and I do kind of wish it was all more interconnected, but the maps themselves are really beautiful to look at, so that does help. Speaking of that, the world really starts to open up as we're sent to rescue our other brother, and the game starts to hint at very slight Metroidvania concepts here, with the introduction of heavy weapons where we can smash through some obstacles. I will say that this isn't like one of those eureka moments you get from a typical Metroidvania where it's an eye-opening, game-changing experience. It's just kind of here in the background and very occasionally pops up. That being said, Tales of Iron continues to lean into its strengths with the world building, and as we're down in these tunnels, we see all these adorable caveman rat drawings, which kind of hints at the history and the scope of the world. We also get to fight with our boy Robin, who absolutely wrecks, and I love how he's so psyched to be killing stuff with us. Meanwhile, the bosses continue to be really tough. Blocky Magoo is a great name, but wow, his moves just seem really inconsistent. So, for example, I thought I could break his stance with arrows when he's charging his attacks, but it only worked a couple of times. On the plus side, the atmosphere is still really great with these little frog dudes playing drums in the background. It just hypes up the fight so much. We also get introduced to poison, which is absolute godsend for some fights, but it does feel kind of strange, like there maybe could have been more here, like maybe different types of poisons or effects, similar to how we get different types of ranged and heavy weapons. Anyway, we go back to the keep triumphant in our victory, only to be told by our advisors, literally the people that work for us, to essentially go back out there and get some gold to rebuild the castle. Now, sadly, I do think this is one of the weakest moments in the game, both narratively and gameplay wise. Narratively, like, come on, we're the king, other people can get money for us, right? And the game even mentions this like it's in on the joke, but I do think it's kind of contrived. They could have handled this a lot better, maybe saying that the royal treasury was taken and we have to get it back. But instead, we're sent right back to where we just came from to do side quests for money, except they aren't really side quests because we need to do them. And this is made all the worse because these side quests involve us going repeatedly to the same locations and us having to backtrack the exact same way we came when we finish it, and it all just puts a full stop to the great momentum the game had going. On the first playthrough, it's not terrible, but on repeats, you'll really start to notice it. This is all compounded too because a lot of these quests involve killing bugs, which personally I think are a bit boring to fight, mostly because you can gut them for bug juice right after, so there's not really a lot of tension as far as healing. The silver lining here is that we get to team up with our guy Robin again, which I'll never say no to. Fortunately, there are side quests here that are good. There's one in the mines that's quick and easy and introduces us to more of the world and world building, which is exactly what a side quest should be. Now, all of the side questing does pay off mechanically when, due to our hard labor, the keep slowly begins to be rebuilt, and we start to have access to the blacksmith, which is cool because we get to make new weapons, and oh my god, there are so many weapons. But I will say the blacksmith mechanic does feel a little undercooked. I mean, there's kind of nothing to it. You just press a button. It might have been better if maybe you could customize customize the creations or if there was like a mini game or something. I don't know why, but it just feels kind of awkward and undercooked. There's just nothing to it. Now, we do get sent down to the crypt, which is a really cool area that has some really interesting lore implications. We fight some undead rats, and the atmosphere is great. You really start to feel out of your comfort zone with limited or no healing, and I started to run really low on my health bug juice. So in desperation, I hit these egg things, and lo and behold, it was that sweet, sweet bug juice. So this was just a great little detail and mechanic that they didn't even explain. The entire area, though, still feels oppressive with toxic frogs and uncharted dark areas, and the optional Thor-style boss here just decimated me the first time, and it all just makes the game feel bigger than it is, with all these secrets and crypts that we can eventually unlock with hidden keys. And just because my pride demands I tell you, I did eventually come back and wreck Thor, and you probably get the best single-handed weapon in the game from it. Anyway, we eventually find our long-lost bard, which is why we came down here in the first place, and he plays some bangers as we do a boss fight. There's also really nice details here too, with the benches down here having their own special design, and after noticing this, I realized that pretty much every bench in every part of the world has this, and it's so cool that they made each of these to fit in their specific ecosystem. Unfortunately, as soon as we come back from the crypt, we're pretty much sent straight back out to get even more money to rebuild more of the castle. And yeah, I don't want to repeat myself, but isn't there a literal frog invasion happening right now? We just saw our people getting butchered in the streets. Surely there's a better use of the king's time than doing side quests, especially because our brother is literally just hanging out in the back drinking ominously. Like, come on, man, can he do this? It really does start to feel like Patty. And the worst part is that it doesn't even need to, because these side quests feature some pretty cool, unique bosses, like the Mosquito King and these kind of lizard monsters, and if it was just dressed up differently, I don't think people would have complained as much. I get that Reggie, unlike many of today's politicians, is a proactive ruler, but narratively and mechanically at certain points, it feels like we're the only person doing anything. We do get to see even more of the world fleshed out with us meeting pup rats, which is a cute little addition, but I think my favorite is the bug farms, and I love these little weird bug cows, and they even make narrative sense because we get our health from this bug Gatorade juice. Speaking of that, I didn't mention this earlier, but the progression of the world feels very natural. So the walk from the village to the mill feels like it all connects together. Each location does feel distinct, but like they do fit together in the same world. Anyway, we have to go back and deal with another frog invasion from the mines, this time with Dennis, and whoopsie, we fall down a bridge. Now, I love how this is foreshadowed by the bridge cracking a bit the first time we walk over it. Anyway, we're dropped into a strange land, and it's very different from the earlier crypts because there are all these crazy pipes running all over the place, which really builds the suspense of dropping into this entirely new and alien world, which is highlighted when we have to power a switch with electricity, which is kind of a shock because I thought this was a medieval world, and all this leads to probably the best plot twist in the game with the introduction of the communist moles. Yeah, apparently there's an entire steampunk society down here that feels totally different from anything else in the game, and you're just kind of thrust into this crazy dystopian world with its own language, technology, and kind of dingy vibe. And you, and I imagine Reggie too, feels like a fish out of water in this entire Metro-esque world that makes you realize that everything you've been fighting for is just a small sliver of this world. You can tell that the devs were just really excited to do this whole mole part, and in every interview I saw of them, they were just practically gushing about it. And I can see why. It really subverts the entire world with so much hidden under the surface. Apparently this all just started as a single mole character, but as the devs kept fleshing out the character with his equipment, his backpack, his music, it all kind of spiraled from there. And I think my favorite part is how Reggie is referred to as Comrade, which is just gold. Now, although we aren't going in here butchering every commie mole we see, we do have to fight in the mole arena, and you can tell that the devs had an absolute blast with this, with a bunch of these guys named after real-life wrestlers. Mole Mysterio, Bulk Mogan, they're just things of beauty, and the entire vibe is just great with this crazy Russian techno music and weird Jabba the Hutt slug-type guy in the back who's never even explained. And this is great because we see little glimpses of the world, like we're only seeing a small slice of the culture here. And it's great that so much is left to the player's imagination. If that's not exciting to you, we also get a gun, which is pretty sweet. Anyway, we have our own kingdom we need to get back to, and to escape, we have to get some gas for this brutal car drill thing. And to do that, we have to fight one of the lizard guys, which again makes for a vicious and fast-paced fight because he's quick and unpredictable. And I love how before he fights him, Reggie says he feels afraid. And in the back of my head, I was thinking, wow, is this really the first time you felt afraid after literally everything you fought just in the past day? I feel like Reggie is kind of the rat's version of Guts in this world. As always, the details are top notch, with even the loading screen changing to Reggie riding a little car back to the keep, which is just great. So from here, the pace really starts to pick up as we return to the Red Keep and find guards at the door. Our advisors tell us that the frogs are attacking again. Now, I immediately assumed when I saw the guards that Dennis took over in our absence because he's always been kind of lurking in the back of a lot of scenes. Now, to continue on this tangent, I thought Dennis as a character was really interesting because after the kingdom fell, you can see him drinking in the background and ominously flipping this coin, and the entire time I thought he was going to turn on us, but it turns out his character arc is completely different, which we'll see more of shortly. Anyway, the frogs burst in, and this fight was done really well. It's cool to see the fights in the background as we fight our own boss, and they actually finish after you finish the fight. Now, this boss fight is actually pretty easy, and it all just goes to show how much stronger we've gotten since the beginning of the game. Now, this last part of the game really starts to feel like a boss rush mode, with us decimating previous bosses as regular enemies on our rampage to beat back the frogs. The pace is unrelenting and only stops when Dennis, like the goofus he is, gets kidnapped in a poisonous area, which we can't get into without dying, so we have to detour back to the Bolshevik Republic to get a gas mask. This involves more Colosseum battles, and while this does kind of disrupt the flow and pacing for me, I won't say no to fighting more mole wrestlers, even though they aren't really narratively our enemy. Anyway, we make it back to where Dennis was captured, and it really does feel like this World War I hellscape. Now, by this point, we're absolutely being littered with weapons left and right, and it can start to feel overwhelming and a little redundant because the weapons are color-coded by tier, so oftentimes I found myself just ignoring anything that wasn't gold unless I really wanted to have a katana or something. And before we move on, at this point in the game, we have all the tools we need to explore all the hidden areas. And it's here that I unlocked the Rat Tomb and fought the secret boss Radis Augustale, which I love the naming conventions that the devs use. We get some great armor, and my stats are pretty much maxed out across the board. I am a little disappointed that even without heavy armor, I have pretty much the highest defense in the game, and it makes heavy armor feel redundant in general. After battling our way to the swamps, we find a turtle who will take us across the river to the frog homeland. This part stuck out to me as kind of a strange addition because the turtle feels kind of random, like he shows up, asks us to flip a switch, and then sails us across, and that's it. The constant reminders about our father are a nice addition, but just feels kind of sudden because this character is never seen again unless I'm missing something. So here we are, the final push into frog territory, and it's great. This time we feel like the tables have really turned. The frog farmers are fleeing from us this time, and it's back-to-back tough fights with a mix of allies. Seeing the toxic and rundown frog area does kind of make you question the motive of the rats though, because you see the frogs' living conditions and it's pretty terrible. And apparently this is supposed to be because of the pollution runoff from the mole people, which paints a pretty messy pictures where the frogs are actually the victims too. And it's really cool that they tied all this together, but I don't think Reggie cares about that because he's in full frog genocide mode at this point. And at the end, we have 3 back-to-back boss fights. This flying medicine frog, a steampunk Dennis who has been infected with the frog drug, I guess, and finally the frog warlord himself, with all of these fights mixing different mechanics back to back. At the end, I really did feel the war chief was a good combination using different phases and movesets that we had encountered throughout the game, so it really was a good test of everything that the game had taught us up to this point. After we take him down, the game comes to a pretty swift and quick conclusion with a pretty happy ending all things considered, despite the massive mountains of bodies that we left behind. Apparently, Reggie will usher in a golden age between the rat and mole people, but if you think about it, there's still a lot of unanswered questions kind of lurking in the back. How will technology impact the rat society? Why were the frogs in the rat crypts? And why did Reggie's father hide the secrets beneath the crypt? Reggie mentioned he would tell his people about the crypts, but I don't think he actually does this in game, and once you look past the surface level happy ending, it does leave a complicated picture, which I kind of love. At the end of the day, you get the the feeling that being king isn't necessarily a good thing. Reggie lost friends, he's confronted with terrible existential truths that the world is huge and the rats are insignificant, and even if his people are cheering for him, and all things considered, it just leaves you wanting more, which is actually a pretty good place to end your game. So as far as gameplay, the real heart of it is the combat, and the dark tone of Tales of Iron really shines through it. While some people do tend to overstate the Souls-like comparison, the game does share some similar mechanics. Instead of Estus, you have Bug Juice, which you harvest from some enemies to heal you, which is a really nice brutal mechanic. On the flip side though, there is no stamina bar, which the devs apparently did so you could just focus fully on the combat itself. So what actually is the combat here? Well, the best way I can explain it is imagine a Frankenstein mix of Salt and Sanctuary, Dark Souls, and God of War, but with rats and frogs. At the core, there's basically a variety of enemy attacks that come your way, and these are jagged yellow lines, which are fast and weak attacks that you can parry with your shield, bold red lines, which mean a powerful attack that you have to dodge away from, and finally thick circles, which are wide-reaching smashes, and you have to get way out of the way to dodge these. Now, most of the time, these specific attacks have to be responded in the appropriate way. So trying to dodge when you're supposed to parry is a recipe for disaster. Most of these feel pretty satisfying to pull off once you get the hang of it, especially the parries, which are way more easy to do than your typical Dark Souls game. But in the heat of the moment, dodging can sometimes feel a little finicky, it has to be said, and it can be confusing to know if you're supposed to roll through something or if you just have to get out of the way completely. In particular, I had a lot of trouble with the wide-ranging smashes, and they really felt a bit janky. The movement can feel clunky at first, but for me at least, when it clicked, I was zipping around, dodging under swords, and sliding away from attacks, and it definitely felt weighty and impactful, especially for the awesomely gory kill animations for each boss. Overall though, Tales on the surface level encourages a very defensive playstyle, which can rub some people the wrong way. Wildly swinging your weapon will get you killed fast, and this leads to a measured pace of combat, with lots of back and forth as you anticipate your enemy's next move. Now, some people criticize it for feeling too reactive, where you're always waiting for the boss to finish their flashy combo before you can finally get a hit in, and I understand. No one wants a game that feels more like a choreographed dance rather than a dynamic anime-style duel. That being said, though, I think the bow and heavy melee attacks do offer some ways to be more proactive. The bow is surprisingly effective, and attacks like the gun can do a ton of damage, and the decision to make it a quick option that you can use on the fly without having to swap your loadout was a really good one. It basically gives you something to do when you'd otherwise just be waiting around for the boss to finish an attack. In a similar vein, you can also use the heavy attack at any time, and even better, it breaks enemy stances, giving you a chance to take control of the combat, although this is a little bit finicky. And all these different attacks and moves do come in handy because the enemy variety is surprisingly pretty varied. Reggie ends up facing all sorts of crazy enemies, from zombie frogs to giant mosquitoes, and it's not just aesthetic. Mechanically, the variation is there. The mosquitoes fly and require range attacks, and these strange lizard things are frantic and require their own strategy, and everything just kind of works. Even your gear has different defenses against these different enemy types. And it got me really excited when I first saw these, and I realized just how many different types of enemies there actually were in this little game. I was a little bummed though when I realized that the only enemy moles were bosses, but I guess it is good that we didn't butcher them, because who doesn't love these little commie cuties? One thing that really surprised me though was how well the game handles group fights. It never feels unfair, and enemies often take turns attacking you, so you're not overwhelmed. Archers will hang back, and it's up to you to decide who to tackle first, so fights do feel really dynamic. I will say though, I think it was a bit of a missed opportunity where the different factions or races didn't attack you at once in combination, so maybe you could have bugs and frogs attacking you at one time. It might not have made narrative sense, but I think it would have been cool to test the different mechanics, because all the different factions and races have different combat styles, and it would have been cool to mix and match. Now, difficulty is often a hot topic in Souls-like games, and Tales of Iron is no exception. But like with most of them, if you're patient and learn the enemy attack patterns, you'll have a much easier time. Reggie is quick and deadly, but he's not very tough. A few hits and it's game over, and this can be especially annoying because one wrong move can trigger a chain reaction of attacks and you'll be dead before you know it. It mostly never feels unfair, and the challenge is definitely there. The good news is that the game handles save points extremely generously, so there's always one that's not very far from a boss fight, so no Anne Orlando-esque mile sprints. The devs apparently very intentionally did this, and I think it's a great idea, because even if you die, you'll be back in the fight in no time, and it really lends itself to, well, why not give it one more go? And the bosses do a good job with this as well, keeping things challenging but always doable, which can be a tough balance for these type of games. I will say the variety is pretty good too, considering the amount of them for a game of this length. It's a 5-hour game, and I think there's around 20 bosses, which is pretty good. You get all the classics in here, with some that test you fighting multiple enemies at once, some that change and progress throughout the fight, some that fly, and some that are just downright unrelenting. They all feel and look distinct too, and I think you can tell that the devs just had a ton of fun designing them. But more importantly than that though, I think the progression is pretty good. They start off pretty slow and cumbersome, but by the end, it really feels challenging and like you're overcoming huge obstacles. I will say though, I wish there was slightly more mechanical variety in the bosses. So for example, I think there was only one with the queen where you can knock back her projectiles, and a lot of these fights essentially boil down to dodge, attack, dodge. Speaking of that, there are other issues. The combat is not perfect. One issue that can get a little annoying is the fight arenas. They're usually pretty small, never really bigger than the screen itself, which can lead to some claustrophobic battles, especially when the game throws a bunch of enemies at you. I touched on this earlier, but I feel like there are some hitbox issues where it feels like you're getting hit even when you shouldn't be. I also have to say, I think the combat feels very 2D, as in you're never really required to jump or make use of vertical space to deal with the enemy, and I think as a 2D game, they really limited themselves here because it effectively halves the amount of space we can move in, and mechanically limits a ton of fights and bosses. If you take Hollow Knight as an example, you're jumping all over the screen to fight the bosses, and it just makes use of the space a lot better. That all being said, even after playing this game 3 times for this review, I never really got tired of the fights. It always felt challenging and fun to do. I do feel like it could be smoother, and I think with another iteration, it would probably be something fantastic, and I really think they're onto something here. But the game is not just combat. There's a mix of light platforming and dialogue moments here at a good pace, so it never feels like you're just bashing frog heads all the time. The platforming is, well, there. It's never really a focus, which is good because Reggie handles jumping about as well as a semi-truck, and it's surprisingly difficult to gauge jump distances. It definitely feels like an afterthought, and you get the feeling like the devs felt it was an unfortunate side effect of making a 2D game, and they tried their best to sweep it under the rug. And hey, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think Tales knows where its strengths lie. The other, I guess, mechanic, if you could call it that, is dialogue. They use animated pictures instead of words, which is a scrumptious little way to convey ideas. There is, however, no text or voice acting aside the narration, and instead there's these little recorded chimes or jingles in the place of words, which is really charming and unique the first time. Even if all I could think was, wow, they blew the entire voice acting budget on Geralt and had to make do with some leftover recorder in the studio. Okay, I don't want to be a bully here, and I do think as an aesthetic choice it works. However, on repeat playthroughs, I will say it does get a little grating. Overall, I think the secondary and tertiary mechanics in this game feel like they could have used a bit more love. I mentioned the blacksmith before, but there's also these little mini trading games, but these basically boil down to pay someone for something, then deliver that to someone else 2 minutes away. I felt the same way about shops. A lot of times they sold arrows and poison, which is kind of unnecessary because yeah, we can get these for free next to 80% of all save points. Balancing out the combat and dialogue is exploration, which is a big part of Tales. The game even incentivizes this when you stumble upon ingredients for meals that boost your health, or keys that unlock unique gear. So taking the time to explore really pays off. That being said, it doesn't really feel like a huge part of a game, and I never really felt clever for finding something. It always felt pretty out in the open. But even despite this, I think exploring is a real highlight. The developers nailed the atmosphere, and it feels like stepping into a pop-up book with this crazy fairy tale vibe, and then bam, the story gets dark and the visuals are right there to back it up. But despite or because of this contrast, it's got this personality and humor and just a heart. It's a game of extremes and they pull off the contrast so well. Different civilizations, different music, different emotions, it all comes together really nicely. The thing that blew my mind when I first played was after I cleared out the frog-infested village, the rats in the background started rebuilding, and as I mentioned before, you can see the progress as you play. Towns get fixed up, people move in, junk gets cleared out, new buildings pop up. It's really cool to see a game that makes these noticeable changes based on your actions. Running through the same town over and over and seeing it look different each time, it really makes the world feel alive. And the lighting and depth really contribute to this. There's these little details everywhere which I constantly enjoyed, from the sounds of hammers from workers in the background to the dramatic downpours during intense moments and toxic fumes leaking out from pipes, and it just adds a real layer of atmosphere. Even the UI in the menu contributes to this feeling that you're fully immersed in this strange and enchanting little fairy tale. And there is a world here. There's this fascinating juxtaposition between the medieval rat kingdom and the underground mole society, and it's great that the devs took the time to give every faction and animal their own unique identity and culture. The moles have the whole steampunk communist thing, the rats have this romantic medieval thing, and the frogs are this tribe. I mentioned this before, but I think it all ties back to how excellent the world building here actually is and really makes you want to go out and explore. Now, one of the biggest surprises in Tales is the sheer amount of gear. I think there's over 200 pieces of weapon and armor, and I honestly never expected that kind of variety in a game like this. Apparently, it was a priority for the devs who really wanted you to personalize Reggie's look and have each build actually be viable. And it's impressive that they managed to fit so much into a game of this size. And the gear actually feels different to use. Well, for the most part anyway. And don't worry, there is fat rolling. But this does bring up a good point, which is that balancing the weight of your gear against your defense and attack rating really does impact how you play. So if you want to be all lightweight and zippy, you can totally go for it. As far as fashion, there are some amazing drips in here, including some that are inspired by The Witcher. But there's different categories for each type of weapon, and usually these fall under light, medium, and heavy to back this all up. And the way they introduce this is pretty clever. So for example, you get a bow, you encounter some mosquitoes, and suddenly realize, whoa, arrows are great for killing flying enemies. And similar for heavy weapons, where you get a heavy weapon and then have to fight enemies with shields, and it really makes you think strategically about your loadout for each fight. You might want to switch to a spear for a longer reach, or trade your bow for a gun for extra damage. Now, the downside is most of the gear does kind of feel more like dress up than anything else. And sure, the fashion souls is fun and they have nice looks, but I was kind of shocked to find out that at later levels of progression, the light gear has almost as much defense as the heavy stuff, so it just boils down to the looks at the end of the day. But when it comes down to it, you're still going to get smacked around no matter what you're wearing. In a nice addition too, they included an armory upstairs in the keep where you can look back at all the armor you've collected, and it really is impressive how much there is here. Okay, so I've talked about this game for 45 minutes now? So where does that all leave us? Despite some slight padding and wonky combat, Tales of Iron shines with its world building and just attention to details. Combat is brutal and satisfying when it clicks, and while the game might be shorter than some would like, those brief hours are packed with some real standout moments, and in my opinion, better short and sweet than long and dull. Games like this really excite me because it throws in Redwall, Metrovania, Soulsborne, Tarantino, communism, and it comes together well. And it's really interesting and incredible too, because juggling all of these concepts is hard, but it works. So I think if any number of these interest you, give it a go. It's cheap, it's fun, and was obviously made with a ton of love. Now, as for the sequel, I haven't delved into it yet, but I'd love to hear your thoughts if you played it. Did it build upon the combat? Was it better or worse? I definitely want to check it out at some point. Anyway, that's all. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support as I get this channel off the ground. If you want to do more to support me, I do have a Patreon, and actually, if you're interested, I run another channel called Exits Examined, which takes up most of my time. That being said, if you have suggestions about games you want me to cover in the future, just drop a comment. It's always really cool to hear your thoughts. Anyway, thanks again. I'll see you next time. Bye.